Brian, welcome to the Oxford Union.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me here.
Great. So, as I'm sure that there are a lot of people in this room who are interested in starting their own company.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about your experience of that back in 2007, 2008?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, I'm really excited to be here. I asked Nikolai any advice for how I should talk today. He said, just pretend like you're at a bar in a semi-drunk state. So, here I am in a semi-drunk state. No. So to understand the story of Airbnb, you almost have to go back to the beginning. I'm from upstate New York in a little town called Niskayuna. Has anyone ever heard of Niskayuna? Okay, don't worry, neither have I, so don't worry. Niskayuna is a small town outside of Albany, New York. My parents are both social workers. So my mom worked with patients in hospitals. My dad worked with people with developmental disabilities. Never growing up did anybody ever use the word entrepreneur. I don't even think I heard that word. In fact, I knew one entrepreneur growing up on Niskayuna, and his name was Bob, and he had Bob's Pizza Shop. And I didn't want to have a pizza shop, so I thought being an entrepreneur wasn't something available to me. And growing up, I was taught to sit still, look straight ahead. I was known back then as a disruptor. That was not a good thing. You just got sent to the principal's office, so there wasn't really much redeeming qualities of being a disruptor. And I remember when I was growing up, one other thing is that I was obsessed with design. And I used to ask Santa Claus for bad toys, poorly designed toys, so I could redesign them. And I was obsessed with different electronics. And then I remember going and I would want to design, redesign cities. I was interested in the amusement parks, theme parks. I got randomly into landscaping and backyard designs, and it was kind of strange. I ended up going to the Rhode Island School of Design, RISD. I get there, and a teacher tells me, she said, basically, Brian, you're a designer. Everything around you was designed by designers. You could design the world that you want to live in. And it was kind of funny because that was very different than what my parents told me, because my mom said, when she was growing up, I was a social worker. I chose a job for the love. I made no money. So choose a job that pays you a lot of money. And then I told her, I'm going to be an artist. And she said, well, you managed to pick the one job that get paid less than a social worker. You'll make nothing. And so I said, well, I'm going to RISD. She said, if you go to RISD, promise me that you'll graduate. And I said, I'll promise I graduate. And she said, also promise me that you will get a job, and that when you get that job has health insurance. So I end up graduating RISD, and I get this job that has health insurance. I become an industrial designer. They say industrial design is like the design of mass-produced objects, anything from a toothbrush to a spaceship and everything in between. And I worked for this very small firm, and entrepreneurs would come to me, they'd have ideas, and it would be basically typically hardware or hardware-software ideas. So whether it was children's ventilators, medical ventilators, or toys, or guitars. I was randomly on a reality TV show, kind of accidentally, if that's possible. There was a Simon Cowell produced show called American Inventor, and there was a magician who had this crazy idea for a better toilet seat called the Pure Flush, if you can imagine. And he was looking for a designer, and he hired me, and so I inadvertently ended up on national television designing a toilet seat. And at one point, a year and a half in, I'm thinking, I'm designing toilet seats on television. How did I get here? There must be a different path. Well, meanwhile, I had a friend who I went to RISD with, Joe Gebbia. He moves to San Francisco, and he's telling me, everyone out here is starting companies. It's amazing. Come to San Francisco. And for many months, I was telling him, no, I'm not going to come. And then one day, it's like my life was like I'm in a car, and the road in front of me, this is the visualization I have, looks exactly like the road behind me. And I say, I should just go to San Francisco. I quit my job. I pack everything in the back of an old Honda Civic. I had this old gray Honda Civic. I even rolled up a foam mattress. And I rolled it in the back seat of the car with duct tape. And I drive up a random middle of the night in October 2007. Of course, when I get there, I can't pay rent. I have around $1,000 in the bank. My rent, I vividly remember, was $1,150. It turns out the weekend I was going to be there, the first weekend, there was the International Design Conference. It was coming to San Francisco. And Joe and I went on the conference website. And they had recommend hotels on the conference website. But every hotel next to the hotel said sold out, sold out, sold out. And we had this idea. We said, well, we have all this extra space. We can barely pay rent. And these designers probably want to stay with other designers. So we said, what if we just turned our house into a bed and breakfast for the design conference? Unfortunately, I didn't have any beds, but Joe had 3 airbeds. I don't know why, he's, I guess, went camping. And so we pulled the airbeds out of the closet, we inflated the airbeds, and we called it the Airbed and Breakfast, airbedandbreakfast.com. And that's where the name comes from. And I remember that conference, we ended up having 3 people that we hosted, a 35-year-old woman from Boston, a 30-year-old from India, a 45-year-old father from Utah. The second night of this conference, I see a designer that I admired, and I come up to him, and I told him about Airbed and Breakfast. I told him it's going to be the biggest thing in the world. One day, thousands of people are going to use this. And he looks at me very seriously, and he said, Brian, and I said, yes. He said, I hope that's not the only idea that you're working on. And I was like, just felt punched in the stomach. And it turns out that I would be so excited about this idea, and Joe would be so excited about this idea, and we tell people, and they just thought it was the worst idea they've ever heard of. They said, there's no way that strangers are going to stay with other strangers. Somebody says, I don't want to give you money because I don't want blood in my hands. Like, people actually said things like that. And they said it was the worst idea ever. So if it worked, I guess it was the worst idea that ever worked.
Great. And when you started working on that idea, you obviously came from a position of being a designer as opposed to a technical person. Yes. What opportunities, benefits, and struggles did that create for you?
I remember, so a couple thoughts about this. So I think it's very important if you want to start a company that there's a saying that sometimes we say, it's good to have a dirty past. Now, not that kind of dirty past. It means like you got your hands dirty. In other words, you don't want to start a company by doing business plans and spreadsheets and market sizing. People who start companies that way don't often end up creating a product that people love. And so it's very typical in Silicon Valley, where I live in San Francisco, that almost everyone who starts a company is an engineer. And so I remember one of the big challenges was people, even if they didn't hate the idea, they didn't often like us because we were designers. And they said, designers don't start companies that are successful. Engineers do. And you didn't go to Stanford, you didn't go to MIT. Well, I was at MIT for a semester, but that was a product development studio. So, but I was not an engineer by training. And so it was considered a liability. But I think, design ended up being a huge strength, because design is not how something looks. Design is how it works, how it fits together. It's the entire ecosystem. And my background as a designer, as an industrial designer, we learned how to design with empathy. In other words, you would do these storyboards of a customer, a customer journey, and you put yourself in the shoes of the person you're designing for. So if you design like a medical device for a child, you might literally go to the hospital and put the gown on and pretend like you're like 5 years old, and you may lay on the bed and imagine the fear. In those moments, you can really design. And I think being a designer was actually a huge strategic strength for us, because we had to, I think in the end of the day, what we invented wasn't a way to stay in someone's home. I mean, we didn't invent that. People have been doing it forever. I remember telling my grandfather about the idea, and he said, that's not new. I used to do that when I was a kid. And it turns out like people used to stay in boarding homes. And during Jim Crow, African Americans stay with other African Americans. So this is not a new idea. We didn't invent this. But one thing that we invented to some extent was this notion of trust between strangers. Because we had this simple idea that we'd bring people together and they wouldn't be strangers. And by redesigning the system so everyone had an identity, we had a secure payment system, and I think just the design of the system looked trusted. I think that had a huge impact on what we were able to do.
Mm. And the Oxford Union here had its first panel on startups at the beginning of this term. And one of the issues which was raised was the ability to have the right amount of capital to succeed in whatever you're doing. How did you go about raising your capital?
Oh God, how did I raise money? It was not pretty. In 2008, I met a guy named Michael Seibel, and he told me that there were these people called angels And the first thing I thought was, oh my God, this guy's insane. He believes in angels. And he goes, no, they're angel investors. They'll write you $20,000 checks over dinner. And then I thought, wait, I lived in LA. That's not a good sign when somebody does that to you. And he goes, no, you just got to have a slide deck. And I'm like, what's a slide deck? And and he said, well, go to this website. There's 15 slides, and there's a whole process to doing it. So we ended up, creating Airbnb, and then Michael introduces us to like 20 investors. And he emailed us, like he gave us all these intros. So basically the best way to get funding isn't to randomly reach out to an investor, but get somebody who that investor trusts to validate you and give you an introduction. So that's what Michael did. And he did it like 20 times. This was huge. And he basically said, like, I don't know if anyone's gonna fund you, but if they are, it's gonna be one of these 20 people. Which basically told me that if one of these 20 people didn't fund us, we're never gonna get funded. And he gives us intros. 10 of them never replied to the emails, and I wrote them like 2 or 3 times. I've never heard from them. The other like 5 or 6 of them replied, and they said, I actually saved a lot of the emails. And in the emails were variations of, we struggled with funding people that weren't engineers. One person said, we just can't get excited about travel. That was crazy. Another person, I was like, really? Wow, where do you go? Another person said, the travel industry is not big enough. It's not large enough. Meanwhile, it's approximately the size of the oil industry. So it's actually fairly large. But there were excuse after excuse. The one first meeting we had with an investor was in a cafe. There's a cafe called University Cafe on University Avenue, which was near Stanford. And so probably similar to one of the cafes around here. And an investor sits down at a chair. Joe and I are pitching him. He orders a smoothie. He's drinking a smoothie. At no point in the presentation does he lift his head up. In other words, he's got his head on a straw like, just nodding like the whole time. And we thought this was kind of strange. But we proceeded to kind of keep going. And we're like, just roll with it. Maybe this is a good sign. He's enjoying it. All of a sudden, he gets up and he leaves. And we thought he was parking his car. But I haven't seen him since, so unless he got really lost. So all that is to say, we were trying to raise $150,000. And we're at a $1.5 million valuation, which means that we were trying to sell 10% of the company, which today would have been worth a few $1 billion, for $150,000, and nobody wanted that investment. So we didn't actually raise money in the early days. And so then we ended up doing what Joe and I like to joke was the Visa round. There's just that Visa didn't know about it. We just kept taking out Visa and MasterCard credit cards. And I don't know, in the United States, we used to collect baseball cards, maybe you do like football cards and sleeves, those plastic sleeves, We put credit cards in those because we had that many credit cards. We literally would be like a stack. And each of us went tens of thousands of dollars into credit card debt. And then in late 2008, I think every entrepreneur's got a story about rock bottom. In late 2008, I hit rock bottom. I was in the kitchen late at night with Joe, and we came to the realization that a year into the concept about Airbed and breakfast, we had made, I think, $1,000 in revenue or something like that with our Airbeds. In other words, we weren't making a lot of money. We thought, Airbed and breakfast, Airbeds aren't making any money. Maybe breakfast will be more profitable for us. So I know what you're thinking. Brilliant, right? And so we think, what if we sold a breakfast cereal? Because the only breakfast you can sell is a non-perishable, like a breakfast cereal. And so it was during the summer of 2008 in the United States, the thing happening in the summer of 2008 was the election of Barack Obama against John McCain. And so we provided housing for the Democratic and Republican national conventions, and we decided to do presidential-themed cereal. So we did a Barack Obama-themed cereal. We picked Cheerios, and we called it Obama O's, the breakfast of change. And we thought, well, if we're going to have an Obama-themed cereal, we have to have a John McCain-themed cereal. So we had a cereal we found out he was a captain in the Navy, and so we named his cereal Cap McCain's, a maverick in every bite. And we had a blue box for Obama and a red box for John McCain. And of course, we're about to make like cereal, and we call up Kellogg's. And they pick up the phone, and I think they thought we were mentally ill. So they hung up the phone, because you just don't call them with ideas like that. Long story short is that we didn't have any money. We ended up finding a former RISD grad who prints us. He says, I don't have any money, but I'm going to print you 500 boxes each of Obama O's and Captain McCain's. He prints us these boxes. No one told me that they would just be giant pieces of poster board that I have to fold and hot glue myself with Joe. It was like I was doing giant origami. I had to do it with hot glue. They should call it burn glue. And I had a perfect 1-to-1 ratio of burn to box. And I'm literally hot gluing at like midnight in a random like October night cereal boxes. And we're stuffing boxes of cereal in. And this long story short is we end up selling $30,000 worth of collectible breakfast cereal. And that was our first round of funding. And so now we say we have a core value. It's to be a serial entrepreneur. Bad joke. But whenever now in the company, because we have a lot of capital now, somebody says, I need more money. I don't have a big enough budget. It's amazing to be able to say, well, let me tell you about a time I didn't have any money. And it's pretty easy. We eventually raised $600,000. We eventually joined Y Combinator. It was a startup seed incubation. We raised $20,000, and then in April 2009, we raised $600,000 at a $2.4 million pre-money valuation. So we valued the company at $3 million. We sold 20% of the company for that. I thought, by the way, at that time was huge, a $3 million valuation. This is where we're like the next like Apple. This is huge, and not having any perspective. And then, meanwhile, the following year, we raised money at a $72 million valuation, then a $1.2 billion, and it kind of kept climbing. But long story short is, here's a thought I have. I think that companies are overcapitalized when they're starting out. I think that you should not need to raise money. I think there's this perception that if you have an idea, you need money. If you don't have an idea, you don't need money. Ideally, you should be able to start a company with only your co-founders. And if you need money, now sometimes there's some fixed cost, but it's so cheap to start a startup, maybe even hardware, and you need to have raw materials. But you should not have to employ people to validate your concept. And so for us, we only need enough money to pay ourselves. And we said we want to be ramen profitable, which basically means you're profitable if all you eat is ramen, meaning you don't need a lot of money. And so I think we split $1,000 a week off the three of us. So I think that creativity creates constraints, and having less capital often makes you hungrier, scrappier, and more creative. And so ideally, there's this thing called product market fit. And product market fit basically means you made a product and it fits the market and it starts taking off. In a perfect world, you do not raise any capital until you've achieved product market fit. And I'm not saying you shouldn't. I'm just saying that the later you raise money, often the better you are. And ideally, it's not an inhibitor for you.
You've recently raised $1 billion.
So yes, I know. Now that seems like an awkward thing to transition from.
But on that,
which is technically 25 million boxes of Obama O's. That's how many I would have to make.
Do you have a specific purpose for this money now?
Yes, we do. So the company is profitable. So there's really kind of two phases of fundraising. When you're first starting out, actually for most of your history, you're raising money as runway. They call it runway because once you run out of runway, the plane just hits a wall. And so runway is basically your lifeline. Starting a company, I found, is kind of like jumping off a cliff, and you have to assemble the airplane on the way down. And that's what it's like. Reid Hoffman told me that, so I can't take credit for that. And so raising money allows the ground to go further and further down. You have more time. And at some point, you tip. And at some point, you go from raising money so you don't die to raising money to invest. So we raised $1 billion most recently to invest. We want to invest in a few major areas. One is we're going to continue to do a lot more with homes. We have more than 3 million homes. We'll soon have 3.5 million homes. And we just acquired a company, Luxury Retreats. So we're going more upmarket. And we're going to do a lot more stuff later this year around homes. We want to help redefine how to stay in a home again. The next thing is experiences, things to do. We want to massively scale experiences. So one of the interesting things is we believe that travel today is pretty broken. If you think about a city you live in, or maybe London, let's take London as a big sample. When tourists go to London, where do they hang out, actually? Where does a tourist go and hang out in London?
Big Ben.
Big Ben. And if you have a free weekend, do you hang out at the Big Ben? In San Francisco, 1 million people live in San Francisco. 16 million people visit every year. And they go to a place called Fisherman's Wharf. Okay, so some of you know. I can promise you, the only people who go to Fisherman's Wharf do not live there. And so there's this crazy thing where there's more than 1 billion international travelers a year. And everywhere travel's like the least informed purchase you'll ever make in your life. Because you're literally doing things that if you lived there and you knew better, you would never do. And the way you know that is look how travelers travel in your own city. And so this thing, it's called mass tourism. And people spend almost as much time on oil, on travel as they do oil, to basically go, to be alone, to be in line, and to do things that people who live there never do. I mean, think about that. People go and they go to art museums. They don't even like art. Why are they at museums? The reason they go to the museums is because they want to get a taste of the culture. They want to be enlightened. And I don't understand why looking at paintings from dead people is the best way to see culture. You know how you see culture? By people who are alive. And so we thought the best way to travel is through other people. That a great trip could send you down a path that does not end you when you return. And a great travel experience is like a great movie. So we studied this thing called The Hero's Journey. Anyone know what that is? From Joseph Campbell. Basically, he wrote this book, A Hero with a Thousand Faces. And he said, almost every movie you've ever seen is the same plot. Hero starts in their ordinary world. Their life, like this is Harry Potter, this is Star Wars. Their life is missing something. They're disenfranchised. They get this call to adventure. They go to this new magical world where they have trials and tribulations. They have assistance. At some point, they have conflict. They may die. The person they are dies. And a new, better version of themselves is reborn. They have atonement. And they go back to the ordinary world. And as we were learning about this, we realized this is like great travel, except the not dying part. In other words, great travel has this promise that you go somewhere, some amazing things happen, you don't just get rested, you're like enlightened, something better about yourself happens, and you come back to the world you came from. And the big insight was the magic in travel comes from people. But when we travel, modern travel came from this thing called the Grand Tour hundreds of years ago, and you would actually go study painting. And the reason people go to see museums today in Paris is because back then they went and they painted, and they actually became artists. And this is the manufactured version. Look at a painting for 4 seconds. Great, now look at this one. So it was stripped of meaning. So the second thing we want to do is redefine how you experience a city, the way you would when you're a local. And we want to do this through experiences. It might be classes you can do, lessons, dinner parties. 2 days ago, we launched music experiences in Airbnb. We have concerts in intimate spaces and homes. Emily Sande did a concert in a home, at the top floor of a home. And my prediction is in 10 years, more people will see concerts in intimate spaces and homes than they will in arenas. And I think that's a crazy prediction, but I think it's actually possible. It's no crazier than Airbnb. And so this is the second thing. And the third thing that we want to invest in is aviation. I would like Airbnb to one day redefine how we fly. And I think today, if you look at modern aviation, it's a pretty, it's a bit stagnating. I remember when I was a kid, the first time I was in an airplane, it was probably 1987, 1988. I was like 7 years old. And I recently was back at that airport, and nothing is different about that airport. Can you imagine still using a phone from the 80s and like that being a good product today? And so I think this funny thing about flying is no matter how successful you get in life, you're reminded of how much of a mere mortal you are when you get on an airplane. And so it's a really bad flying experience. And so I think that's another area that we really want to invest in.
And you've recently been appointed as a CEO and head of community. At what point did you realize that Airbnb has a huge impact on whole communities and millions of people worldwide?
Yeah, so I'm CEO, and this past week I decided I would expand my title from CEO to CEO and head of community. And the reason I decided to do that is I realized I was implicitly head of the community. But people kept writing about us like we were like every other business. But when I met with our community, our guests and our hosts, they didn't think of Airbnb as much a company as a community. And most companies, great companies, the CEO is obsessed with the product, and they're essentially the chief product officer. And so whoever makes this water, I hope the person who actually that runs this company cares deeply about this product, because if they don't, it's not going to be a really good business. In fact, I remember getting advice in the early days that, and this is the best advice I've ever given, so the best advice I'll give you was not even my advice, but the best advice I got was something so simple. We got these T-shirts from this program called Y Combinator, and on the T-shirt it said, "Make something people want." It's almost too simple to work. Paul Graham, our first investor, said, "It's better to have 100 people love you than 1,000,000 people that just sort of like you." The way to have a successful business is just to make something, maybe unscalable, that 100 people love. If they love it, they'll tell everyone else about it. And so in the early days, we realized we'd be obsessed with our product. But our product wasn't the website. It was the community. It was our product, our host, who offer their homes and now experiences. And so I felt like if you as a CEO deeply care about your product, you have to be one and the same. And our product is our community. And so I wanted people to know that we aren't just leading a company, we are leading a community, and they should look to me as that head of community. So I think this is just really a alignment of our vision. But I think that it's really special to be able to lead a community. We have more than 150 million people in the community now. And I'll give you a couple random points of perspective. On New Year's Eve this past year, 2 million people came from 191 countries and traveled on Airbnb. That's every country in the world but North Korea, Iran, Syria, South Sudan, and Crimea. 2 million people in one night living together. And never, to my knowledge, would that have been possible before that night. That was a giant community living together. And so we realized we have this huge responsibility for these people, because unlike other products like Facebook, where the entire product is pixels on a screen, essentially, ours is a community of people living together. A woman in Texas staying with a man in the Middle East. You have countries that have never really lived together before. You have people on their weddings and honeymoons. And so you have all these interesting dynamics that you have to design for. And I remember somebody said to me, "You have like the hardest job of any CEO in a portfolio." This is an investor. And he said, "You have to worry about trust, because you have two people living together, and then you multiply that by 2 million. The 1 in a million occurrence happens twice a day on Airbnb. Then you have to deal with payments, and we handle billions of dollars through our system in almost every country in the world. We have regulatory challenges, because what we're doing is something where there's presumably not a legal framework that's been written, because most laws were written before things like the internet, especially when the internet started blurring what was the notion between private and commercial. We have to be on every platform. So unlike Uber, Instagram, we have to also have a website, because most of our traffic comes during work hours. So basically people at their job, and I think they're actually not working. So we can confirm that. And we have to design for the real world. We have to design for multiple industries. We have to be in the service business, because if you have a problem, like a hotel, you have to be able to call the front desk. So we can't provide internet-level customer service, which is like terrible customer service. You have to provide actually good customer service. And so the entire thing is a whole system. And then our search problem. Google is known as the leaders in search. But when you type something into Google, usually the first answer is the right answer. When you type a home in Paris on Airbnb, there's 90,000 homes. There is no perfect home. So actually, it's not about search, it's about matching. And so we're like two stars colliding in the sky. We have to match 150 million people with some variation of 3 million homes plus thousands of experiences. And so the entire thing is one giant system. And if any one of those things breaks down, your vacation is completely ruined. And not only is your vacation ruined like a hotel, you might be in a foreign country where you're like on a street with luggage with your family, and it's cold and it's at night and you have no idea what to do. And so this entire thing is one system, one community, and every piece has to fit together.
Have there been times when you used Airbnb yourself?
Never. Just kidding. That would be really weird. Literally tonight I'm staying at Airbnb, and I stayed in one last night. And so we literally started Airbnb. We were the first host, and we couldn't afford to stay. And then in early 2008, we launched the second version of the website. Basically, we launched and like a few people used it, and then no one used it. So we decided we'll just kind of launch again. Because if you launch and no one notices, did you really launch? That was kind of my point of view. They don't really notice, so you just launch again. So we kept launching. But the second time we launched in spring 2008, we launched and we had 2 bookings. And I was one of them. And so I was 50% of our business. But it was using the product that was so important. So many people manage a business by numbers. And you do need metrics and instrumentation to run a business. But the most important, I think, heuristics that you can have when you're running a company is using a product and making a product that you're passionate about yourself. And so I literally practically have at times lived on Airbnb. In fact, in 2010, we started our company in an apartment. We stayed in our apartment. And at one point in a 3-bedroom apartment, we had 20 people working in a 3-bedroom apartment. So some people worked in 1 bedroom. We had people working in the kitchen. We had a salesperson who did calls from the bathroom. It's like, sounds like you're in a cave. She's like, no, I'm in a bathroom, thank you. And we were running out of space in 2010, June. And so I decided to just give up my apartment. And I was looking for a place, a new house. And I thought, wait, we have this website, Airbnb. And so for nearly a year, I think it was like 9 or 10 months, I stayed in a different home every week on Airbnb in San Francisco. And so I just started living on the product. And I never got more connected than then about what a great experience looks like. And so like when you bought an iPhone, Steve Jobs didn't come and sleep on your couch, but I did. And so I literally went door to door staying with people. And I think that closeness and that proximity was so important to perfecting every design detail.
Great. I will now let students ask their questions, and I'm sure there will be plenty.
Whoa.
If you'd like to ask a question, please wait for one of the committee members to bring a microphone over to you. If we can have a question from the member in the 6th row, with a scarf on. Lady with a scarf on. No, just in front. Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
Okay. So I was reading a couple of years back that when you wish to learn something, you usually prefer going to the source instead of picking up a book maybe. But now that you see yourself in what is uncharted territory, how do you decide with, say, suppose this investment, where you need to go next? Or what do you use as a guiding principle?
That's a really good question. So I'll just repeat the original principle and then I'll talk. Originally, I had this challenge. You probably have it at school, right? Like you have to learn about a subject. And the way you learn about a subject is, what do? Well, you read about the subject. But if you really want to be an expert in the subject, you probably read a lot about the subject. So you read everything. Well, here's the problem. When you start a business, that's nice if you only learn one thing. But what happens when you have to learn about like 5 things in a week? And by the way, you have to kind of be an expert at them quickly, because if you're not, you may make a fatal mistake. So what do? You can't read 10 books on 5 subjects and read 50 books. So at least I couldn't. So what would you do? So what I would do is if I had 10 hours to learn something, instead of spending 10 hours learning, I would spend at least 5 hours, maybe longer, learning who the definitive source is. And so often you'd spend time either asking who's the best, like you'd ask somebody who knows a lot about the subject, and you ask, who is the definitive authority? And they'd say someone or some things. And you'd go to them, and you'd ask them, or you'd research who they thought the definitive authority was. And so it's basically triangulating a peer review towards the definitive source. And then you'd learn about that subject. Because picking the wrong lessons could lead you down a wrong direction. And so for me, I studied like Walt Disney and Steve Jobs, and I picked lessons from them about how they built products, and not like the CEO of some conglomerate. That would have been, for me, the wrong lesson. And so I call that going to the source. And the only thing I'd say about going to the source is oftentimes there are many people that are willing to help you if you just ask. And the number one reason people don't ask is they think they're bothering the person. And maybe you are, but like, who cares? Because they'll just avoid you, and then you can either keep bothering them or not. But the idea I learned was to be shameless. And I was shameless to seek out people that could help me every step of the way. And the more successful I got, the more access I had. So I'd start by asking other entrepreneurs, people maybe a year or two ahead of me. And then I got to the place where I was really shameless and became more successful. So I could meet with like people like Warren Buffett or Jonathan Ive, head of design at Apple, and people like that. So there's a really good question, though. What happens when there is no source? like, who do I seek today to figure out where Airbnb goes? Because the scary thing, there's nothing more scary in the world than realize no one knows anything more than you on a subject matter. And you're like, oh shit, if I'm the source, it's kind of scary. And so at some point, you develop enough experience that you do a couple things. The first is you try to understand the guiding principles. So let me try to think of an example. Let's take aviation, because that's one I'm learning about now. So the first thing you do is you seek out sources that are experts in aviation. So I started meeting with like CEOs of airlines, and I learned from them about the industry. I asked them what the best book on aviation was, and everyone said this book called Hard Landing. So I read this book on hard landing. And then I brought a former head of a major airline as an advisor to me. But the other thing I did is I started looking laterally to other ideas. And I learned that, for example, there were people that studied and created circular runways so airports could be closer to cities. I learned about technology where there's vertical takeoff planes, and the higher a plane. So I met with like Elon Musk, and I peppered him questions about where he thought aviation would go. And so you start to ask people in a wide field of view, and then you start to combine different ideas. So you start to say, like, what if instead of, what if like you took a home and you put it in the sky, and you start to merge ideas. So for me, it starts to be about synthesizing different ideas. So you learn everything about a subject, and then you identify some key principles, and then those key principles you learn about subject matter, and then you typically combine them. So this is maybe how I would do it. Or like if you're trying to learn about office design. The way I learned about office design was I said, I don't want to have an office, I want it to feel like you're at a home. So I actually studied residential design, and I combined residential design and studied that and combined it with workspace. So I basically took home design and I combined it with a design studio like RISD, and I studied the two of them, and with architects we merged the two ideas. And so often in uncharted territories, you're looking for adjacent ideas and adjacent analogies. I mean, creativity is essentially just taking divergent ideas and synthesizing them, and that's probably one of the things I do fairly often. Maybe the last thing is just, at some point, you have to take big bets on intuition.
Great. Next question. If we can go to the same road, just most right. Yeah.
So if I'm not mistaken, you turned profitable in the second term of 2016. So it took quite a long time for Airbnb to turn profitable. And I guess a lot of different points in time you had to decide whether you would like to grow more, to expand more, or start concentrating more on your resources. So what were the challenges in becoming profitable, and what were the key decisions that you made in terms of how much you're going to scale and how much you're going to grow before you focus more on profits? Thank you.
Yeah, so really good question. Being profitable is a choice to some extent. It's not totally a choice, like maybe you just can't be and it's not within your means. But for us, it was always a choice. And we always said that we always want to be less than maybe half a year or a year away from being profitable. And we always want to have more than that in runway meaning how much money we have in the bank. And so at any moment, we could be turn on and be profitable. And the reason that we weren't profitable is that we decided we want to invest ahead of growth. And so we wanted to grow as quickly as possible. Because when you're starting out, you're kind of under the radar. But then once everyone knows about your idea, they can copy you. And in our business, what made our business so strong was this thing called network effects. And a network effect basically means a network becomes more effective every time another person gets added to it. So most products don't get better when more people use it. But when it's a community and network, it actually gets stronger. And so we thought, we have to grow as quickly as possible, because if you're a travel website and you type in like a city and 3 homes come up and none of them have been reviewed, it's actually a poor quality product. So we had a product that had to grow quickly to get to network effect so that it would be a high quality product. And if you weren't at network effect, you were what we call danger zone. It's kind of like a missile. It takes off, and before it reaches the atmosphere, it gets really shaky, and then it blows up. And so we had to get into the atmosphere. And so we thought we were going to invest ahead of growth. So we spent, at some point in early years, we spent as much money as we made on revenue on marketing, actually twice as much. So we had negative 100% margins for in 2010 or something like that, 2011, really early days. So we'd be investing ahead of growth. But it was always based on a thesis that we understand our core unit economics. We can be profitable within, let's say, 6 months if we really had to, but we're making a choice. At some scale, though, you have to decide, that you don't want to keep doing that, because we could just do that forever, right? You could keep doing, you could do it today, and at some point the organization gets so large. And for us, we decided like 2 years ago that we had crossed the, we were at the $1 billion or so revenue mark, and we thought that's around a size where we don't want to institutionalize losing money. In other words, that we don't want that to be a habit and a way, part of the culture. The part of the culture to lose money. And so we were super scrappy from the days of hot gluing cereal boxes, and we thought being profitable was a way to control our destiny, be scrappy. I know it probably sounds weird to be scrappy with those kinds of budgets, but it just means doing more with what you have. And we also decided, the last thing I'll say around funding is when you start a company, you go through 3 stages. The first stage is you build the product. And that stage ends when you get to basically product market fit. Then stage 2 starts. And stage 2 is now you build the company that grows the product. And so now you got to hire people and you scramble. This is typically when you're raising a lot of money. And stage 3 is you become kind of more professional, a little more administrative, and you hire an executive team. If you succeed to do all of that, you succeed to go back to step 1, which is to create a new product. And that's what we started getting to by the end of Homes. We built the product, scaled the product, hired an executive team. It was running really well, or fairly well. And now we were ready to start all over again. And the analogy I made was I always wanted our core business to be profitable. And I studied why companies die. Like why did, there's all these computer companies from the 70s and 80s that you've never heard of, or like Silicon Graphics or the Altair or something, or like even Nokia or BlackBerry have struggled. And I started wondering why these companies died. And a lot of companies died because they launched a product, it got really successful, but they couldn't launch the next product. It was a second album problem. And why does a company fail to launch a second product? It was totally counterintuitive. It wasn't that they lost their ability to innovate. It's that the core business, the thing that made them successful, wanted all the money, all the talent, all the resources. And anything new was dismissed as small and insignificant. So the analogy I made was think of it was almost like to teach this principle to the company, I basically retold a version of a children's book. I said, here's Mama Bear. Mama Bear has these little cubs. And Mama Bear is eating food. And these little baby bears. And Mama Bear, if she takes all the food, she eats it for herself, baby bears starve. And so Mama Bear should feed the babies before she eats. And people are like, yeah, it's kind of silly and stupid. And I say, so if you believe that, then why does Mama Bear, our core business, need all the resourcing and all the prioritization before these new projects? Because nobody raises a child the way companies treat their new products. They put them aside, and the laboratory is not the problem. It's taking something out of the lab and scaling it. They never treat it the way a parent treats a child, which is a priority. And so you have to overfund and overprioritize new projects. And the number one reason I believe that companies do not launch new products is they get this backwards. And it's actually incredibly intuitive when you think about it. And so this is where we're putting the money.
Next question. Please can we go to the, I think it's 8th row? Yeah. Yeah, just here. Thank you.
Hi, Brian. Thank you so much for coming.
Yes.
So I actually have 2 questions, so feel free to pick one or answer both if you're like.
Yeah.
So first question is about safety in China, or I guess trust issues in China. I know Airbnb is facing a lot of competitions, and I'm wondering what are some of the things that you guys are doing on kind of changing people's behavior and also perceptions about staying at homes, particularly in China where culture, I guess trust is still an issue. Also, the second question is, Paul Graham called you guys cockroaches. So, while you guys are maxing out credit cards and can't find investors, what are some of the things that made you so firmly believe in it and you keep going instead of giving up? Because I think normal people would just have given up. So, thank you.
Yeah, maybe I'll try to answer both questions. I'll start with the second one. In early 2009, we entered this program called Y Combinator. And this is after all the investors said no to us. So I remember the day of Y Combinator, Joe, Nate, and I said, we're going to enter this program, and at the end of it, if the Airbnb doesn't take off, we'll work on other stuff. And we end up getting this program. And years later, Paul Graham said, the reason I let you in this program was because the financial crisis had hit in late 2008. You remember the global Great Recession? And so 2009, we entered the Great Recession. And nobody thought people would invest in startups. In fact, I remember investors said, I lost my money in good companies. Why would I invest in this company? And so at this point, Paul Graham said it's an investment nuclear winter. We're looking for people who won't die. And so he called us cockroaches. Because he just said, like, you just won't die. Like, you'll sell cereal, do whatever, but you won't die. The reason why we wouldn't die was because we were resilient and we had tons of conviction. And I think that these are two attributes that get underestimated: resilience and conviction. And I think one of the best ways to not die is, one of the best ways to not fail as a startup is to not die, or is you keep working on it. In other words, startups usually just fade away. They just crumble. You stop working on it. In fact, Paul Graham said usually startups they die of suicide, not homicide. They die of self-inflicted wounds, and the self-inflicted wounds are usually just run out of momentum. You want to stop working on it. The reason I kept working on it with Joe and Nate was when you start a company, you have to know something that nobody else knows, which is why you're starting that company. In other words, someone will ask, what unique insight will you have? And if you don't have a unique insight, it's very, very hard to keep going when it gets really low. And our unique insight was that randomly, maybe by accident, that one weekend, we host these 3 people. And we became friends with them. And one guy ended up inviting us to his wedding in India. Another woman ended up moving to San Francisco. And so some of their lives were slightly altered. Ours was. And so we had this insight that you could share your home, make extra money, and make friends. And it was just this thing. And we said if people could experience what we had experienced, this would be an idea that would spread around the world. So it was this discovery. We were less visionaries and more discoverers of a new idea. And so that's what kept us going. Uncompromising notion of what we were trying to do with our principle. And we had the simple belief that what if one day you could go to any community in the world, any city, any village, any town, any neighborhood, and instead of feeling like an outsider or a stranger, which is what you would do today, presumably, or what you would have done, you feel like you are part of that community. You belong in that community. Just like you live there. And that's always been the guiding principle. On China, I'll be in China in like a couple weeks. We are actually, I believe, at last count, the largest company in China for home sharing. There's a couple competitors. It's absolutely a very competitive market. I've often asked 2 things. The first thing I get asked is, like, almost every American company's failed in China. So Google got blocked, Facebook got blocked, Snap's not there, Twitter's not there, Microsoft, it did not work out super well, and so Amazon, eBay didn't work out. So every American executive says they're different, and I'm like, but we're different. and I kind of joked about it, but we kind of got lucky. We started a company that's a global network, and so if you live in China and you want to travel around the world, and a couple 100 million people in China every year leave the country of China, and the government actually encourages them to travel. If you want to stay in a home, you're not going to use a Chinese website. The reason why is if you live in Oxford here, a person in Oxford is more likely to have their home on Airbnb than the Airbnb of China. If that makes sense, right? You're not going to necessarily use a Chinese website because very few Chinese companies have global platforms. And so we happen to have this 2-sided global network effect marketplace, which I think was mostly good fortune. And it's allowed us to become fairly successful in China. And the other thing about China is in like 30 or 40 years, they've gone through an industrial revolution, a cultural revolution, an information revolution, which here in England happened over like 300 years. So can you imagine 300 years of history happening in like 30 years? Like how? So it means that people are so inclined to do new things. They're very entrepreneurial, and they're very inclined to try new things. And so millennials want to do new things like stay in Airbnb and stay in homes. Now the question is, how do you keep them really safe? And we do a lot of screening and vetting in our business in China, actually more than even anywhere else. So the quality standards for homes in China are even higher. And we consistently call the bottom 10% of our homes. And we have even recently cleaned up the site quite a bit. We try to have excessively higher quality standards in China from the supply side. And on the guest side, we do things like institute verified identification. And verified identification, which is something that exists a lot in our platform, is essentially we verify that you are who you say you are. So we get a copy of your driver's license or your passport, and then we ask you to take a selfie, and then through a basic facial recognition software, we match the two and then try to do a few other things to have a reasonably high confidence score that you are who you say you are. And then we partner with local cities and local public service bureaus to make sure that people can ensure that these experiences are safe. So it's a lot of also partnership with the governments. And we have a pretty advanced trust and safety team, and we use a lot of machine learning, and we're starting to use deep learning. The more popular term would be probably called artificial intelligence, where you start to look at patterns, because we have hundreds of millions of people searching, all the time. And so you can start to pick out patterns and behaviors. So we even have behavioral scientists that look at how people search, behaviors, things that are anomalies, and then based on the behaviors, the patterns, the anomalies, plus the reputation and the identity, there are certain scores we have, and that helps us decide whether or not we allow somebody to do business on the platform.
Next question. Can we go to the first row, please?
Thank you for a really interesting talk,
Thank
Brian. Your company is obviously, a multi-billion-dollar company, international today, and I was wondering, what are the things that keep you awake at night, and sort of how has that changed over the last sort of 5 years?
What keeps me awake at night? I'd probably say two things. So it's always funny when everyone says, what keeps you up at night, they always assume it's some threat outside coming in, like regulators, and what about all these policy or trust and safety, and none of that really keeps me up at night. It's two things. One about Airbnb and maybe one broader theme happening in the world. The thing about Airbnb is, again, I studied a lot of the companies that failed, right? There's so many companies that were huge successes. They were institutions, and they don't even exist anymore. And we've talked a lot about the world changed, they didn't change, they missed the internet, they couldn't do the second product, they don't have, it's like the second album problem, they can't come out the next thing. There's a broader theme why these companies fail. And the reason these companies failed, I would say, if I could say it in a sentence, is they stopped being a startup. That companies start to be startups. And startups are basically, the definition of startup, I think, is a company built for scale that grows really quickly, or at least the purpose is to get to scale. So a restaurant is not a startup, but if you build something that's meant to be a chain, it becomes a startup. And so you build a startup to be highly innovative. And so it's nimble. It's like a small ship. It can move, it can change direction, it's novel, it goes somewhere no one else goes. And at Apple, Steve Jobs said, Apple is the world's largest startup. A lot of people say when you get to our size, you're not a startup. Steve Jobs insisted that Apple, before he died, was a startup. And he basically said that it was a startup so long as they were innovating and still growing and still scaling. So long as this is still the first chapter of a long book, you're a startup. And Pablo Picasso had a saying. He once said, the older you get, the stronger the wind gets, and it's always in your face. And that can be true of startups. So probably the number one thing that keeps me up at night is, do we stay a startup? Do we stay innovative? Because it's not external things it's usually suicide, it's self-inflicted wounds. And when you're a really big company, I think somebody once said it's the ABCs, the arrogance, bureaucracy, and complacency, that usually sets in and prevents companies from staying innovative. And I think it requires often a CEO that's very hands-on, a founding CEO often, that's constantly challenging people. And so one of my primary jobs is support people, but also challenge them, encourage them to be bold, give them the courage to seek something that they would not otherwise have comfort to do themselves. And as a founder, I have moral authority to do that. I'll say one other thing that keeps me up at night a little bit, and it's more about the world. That if you were to follow this principle called, everyone here probably heard of Moore's Law, the notion that Gordon Moore from Intel discovered a few decades ago, that the speed of a microprocessor doubles at, actually the number of transistors, but it basically means the speed of a processor doubles every 2 years. It basically means that your hardware, your computing power, if it's doubling every 2 years, think of it as the power, the forces of the internet, the amount of information being exchanged is doubling every couple years. If you were to extrapolate that forward, it would suggest that in many industries, the next 100 years, so think about today, if you have a grandchild, before your grandchild 100 years ago presumably will still be alive, and in their lifetime, that child will see more change than humanity's seen maybe in the last 20,000 years since before farming, if you were to just extrapolate out things like Moore's Law. And so whether or not you believe that, it's probably safe to say the next 100 years will change a lot more than the last few hundred years. And there's a lot of things that are going to change. One thing that's going to change is artificial intelligence. I think artificial intelligence will be more profound than computers, the internet. I mean, we'll leverage all these things, but will be more important than any technology thing we've ever seen. And I think this provides a lot of exciting opportunities for humanity, but it also provides some threats. For example, there was a study by The Economist. Actually, I think it was a study commenced here at Oxford. And yeah, it was a study here at Oxford. And it said the conclusion of the study was that 48% of American jobs would be automated in 20 years. I think this study was from 2014, 2015. It appears in hindsight that that study was highly conservative. In other words, many more jobs will be automated. There may not be drivers in the future. There may not be cashiers in the future. There may not be people manufacturing, assembling at a mass-produced scale in the future. But jobs like what medical workers, doctors, radiologists, many other types of highly skilled jobs. As soon as a computer or a device in your pocket can do what a supercomputer cannot do, and these networks become neural, then I think there's some huge risk to humanity. And so the question is, what will everyone do in the future? And so I think this is a major thing we don't talk a lot about. There's a lot of instability here in, I guess, presumably the UK in the wake of Brexit, certainly in our country with our new president. And a lot of that instability came from income inequality and people believing that the next 10 years, that their children or their future won't be as good as it was. Make America great again. It's about the world is going to be great like it used to be. And the problem is that we're not going to go backwards. And in fact, the future is going to only accelerate even faster. And you can't go backwards. There's the old Tom Friedman said, it's like the only way to not fall off is like a bicycle. You have to just keep moving. You have to move really fast. But automation and autonomy is going to accelerate a lot. And so what I'm focused on is how can people remain relevant in the future? It seems like an absurd thing to ponder, but I actually think it's not absurd. It's going to happen very, very quickly. And I think that people will do things that only people can do. It's almost an obvious statement. Well, what's unique about people? I think things that involve creativity, about caring, things around love, belonging. You know, I don't think a robot's going to raise a child anytime soon. The moment they do, maybe none of my questions even matter. So I want to participate in a movement of global entrepreneurship. I would love to see 10, 20 million, maybe more entrepreneurs on Airbnb that are created. And I hope through other entrepreneurs, hundreds of millions of entrepreneurs are created in this world. And I would like the world to not look like the movie WALL-E, if anyone's ever seen that Pixar movie WALL-E, and to look a little more like a global village, where maybe made in the UK or made in America becomes made in your neighborhood. And there's local makers, there's people who do services, creativity, education, and things are highly local, and there's a path for people. And so these are some of the things that I'm thinking about.
Great. Next question. Can we go to the third row on this side then?
Hi, thank you so much for coming. So you've spoken a lot on the product and how you built it. I wanted to know about the culture within Airbnb now, as in how you ensure the development of the talent and how you ensure that the talent is always growing and learning more.
Yeah, one of the things we didn't talk, it's a really good question. One of the things we didn't talk about is culture. One of the most important things that I do at Airbnb is focus on the culture. I remember one time somebody came to me, an advisor, and he drew on the wall a boat. So he draws like this boat, and he draws a water line. And he said, you're a CEO, you're like captain of the ship. And he draws some holes, some circles below the water line. And he said, your job is to focus on anything below this water line, anything that can sink the ship. And he said, you also need to pick a few areas that are differentiating and defining to your company. And so I thought long and hard, like what is defining about our company? And I picked 3 or 4 areas. the first thing I picked was culture. I picked our brand. I picked our product and our community, and these were actually, it was those three things. I thought culture was really the foundation. In other words, culture was the machine, the foundation that created all future things. So culture is essentially, everyone's got a culture, and the culture is the shared ways that you do things, the shared behaviors that govern your organization. And the more unique and the more specific they are to you, the more the culture. So if everyone's honest, you'd say it's not really a cultural thing. And so we thought a lot about what kind of culture do we want to create? What kind of behaviors do you want to create? Because one day I won't be in the room, and culture is what often people do when you're not in the room, when the person in charge is not in the room. And we, in the early days, wrote out a bunch of core values. In fact, we wrote out a bunch of principles, things that were important to us. And we wrote them out, and we said, before we hire anyone, we're going to know exactly what we're looking for. And we were looking for a few things. Today, we have 4 core values. The first we call serial entrepreneur. Now, we didn't call it back then that, but we basically mean somebody who's very entrepreneurial, very scrappy. Somebody who can work backwards from a big idea. So they're relentless, and they'll find a way to get there with limited resources. The next core value is the second one. We have our own words to describe it, but someone who's mission-driven. We say champion the mission. Somebody who's deeply passionate about the community and is community-led and the cause of Airbnb. So you have to care a lot about the purpose of belonging and community. The third thing we call be a host. It's basically somebody who's deeply caring, and they care about making others belong. This is unique. Not everyone cares about these things. And the fourth we called embrace the adventure. It was people that were highly curious and were kind of young at heart and were willing to try anything. And we felt like these 4 qualities were things that defined 3 of us founders. And they kind of touched a lot of our business. And we thought to be successful, we would need people that had these qualities. And so we started hiring people. And the most important thing you can do to have a really good culture is hire really good people, because you will bring in people and they'll all share a behavior. And a lot of companies get things wrong because they just try to hire like smart people or really talented people, and they look at their resume. And actually, maybe a better analogy would be culture is what they would say at your eulogy, right? So like if you died, what would they say about you? Well, that's kind of that's probably more important than whatever's in your resume. And so you look at like, who is this person? What do they care about? What's unique to them? And that's culture. I probably interviewed the first 400 or 500 people. I literally did thousands of interviews. And we would wait months and go through pain. We needed to hire someone. But I would sit across from somebody and I said, if I had to hire 10 more people that were like this person, would I want to still have this person at the company? And the reason you ask that question is because eventually you empower them to hire a team. And so they tend to hire people that have their values. And so you have to be very, very careful. And so for me, culture, it was also things like rituals. It was 1,000 things, 1,000 times, whatever was embodied in the organization. And it was things that were controversial, decisions you'd make. And I think one of the greatest assets to Airbnb today is its culture. It's invisible. When investors value companies, they never value the culture. They don't know how to measure it. They pretend like it doesn't really matter. It's something that the company worries about. But if I wanted to understand the health of a company and how strong it would be, I would look to the culture. And that culture would show me the strength of the bond between people. If its culture is strong, why would you want a good culture in the first place? This is the last thing I'll say. In this room, imagine we all do work on something together. We have to have rules that govern how we all behave. And so you can either be in a low-trust organization. In a low-trust organization, if none of us know each other and trust each other, I would need to give every one of you a manual. And here's how you do this, here's how you do this, here's how you do this. But if this is a high-trust organization, then I can just tell you, do the right thing. By the way, here are the 4 values of the company. Here's our mission. Here's why we exist. Just do the right thing. You can't go on the street and tell somebody to do the right thing. They may have a different definition than you do. And so a high-trust organization looks more like a family. And in families, they don't have rules. And you can move really fast. And we felt like to be the world's biggest startup, we had to be a high-trust organization that moves very, very fast. And so we felt like having a very strong culture meant being very, very innovative. In low-trust organizations are like going on the street, and you don't know somebody. And so therefore, not much can happen.
Okay. Next question. Please can we go to the 5th row, just where you are. Yeah. Go on.
Hi.
Hi.
First off, thank you so much for coming. So I'm actually a visiting student from UC Berkeley, and
Oh,
as
nice.
you know, in the Bay Area, gentrification is a pretty big issue. So I was wondering, as a company who has put a lot of effort into ensuring that your platform doesn't perpetuate discrimination of traditionally marginalized people, what role do you guys think that you play in this issue? And then I have a second question, which is, what can I do to get an internship at Airbnb this summer?
Really good question. And let me ask a clarifying question on the first question. Are you talking more specifically about discrimination of people staying together, or more about like housing constraints in cities like San
I
Francisco?
think more about
and
like housing constraints.
Okay. Maybe I'll answer that question. I can also talk a little about discrimination as well. So with regards to here's the interesting thing. One of the things I learned in design school was that you have to consider the ramifications of the design of your product. So for example, when I went to RISD, there was this huge push about green design and sustainability. And there wasn't just enough that your product was something that people wanted. Was it good for the world? And so this was something that we thought a lot about. When we started Airbnb, we didn't really know about or consider negative externalities. And we started Airbnb, and actually, when Airbnb started, there was this thing called Craigslist. It still exists. And it was like an open marketplace. And Craig Newmark, who started Craigslist, said, community is like an immune system. It's not our job to intervene. The immune system will take care of itself. And I kind of came from that Craig Newmark, Pierre Omidyar, founder of eBay, kind of school of thought, that these things were a little bit more hands-off immune systems. In fact, we didn't even require people to have photos back then. And over time, as we got much larger, it became very clear that there were real consequences beyond the guests and the hosts to our business. And so once you start to have thousands of homes in a city on your platform, there's a potential for negative externalities. And I noticed it fairly early on, although probably underestimated the extent of it, that there was probably two particular negative externalities. The first negative externality was there were some landlords and some property management or commercial listing companies that realized you can make a lot of money by renting your home on a nightly basis rather than having a one-year tenant. And so we would take a unit that was dedicated for a one-year tenant and they'd turn it into nightly rentals. And for a long time, we didn't really know the extent of what this was a problem. We didn't know what to do with it. And we started meeting with cities, and it became very clear this is a huge problem. So what we ended up doing was, now we have agreements with over 200 cities around the world, tax agreements, but we also have registration agreements and other types of agreements with cities. And so we initiated this thing we call the Community Compact. It's basically a commitment. And the first thing we said is we believe there's a housing constraint, we will limit, we do not want to be part of the problem, we want to be part of the solution. And so we've instituted one of two things. In New York and San Francisco, we've identified, obviously, it doesn't take much to identify it, a major housing constraint. And so we limited hosts to one home. So you cannot manage a bunch of properties. And if you tried to have a bunch of accounts, we would block them or remove them. And we actually police this system. But the other thing, we do this here, or not here, in London, is other governments decided they would limit the number of days that you'd rent, right? It was like, how a unit wouldn't be taken off the market if we limited the number of days. And so London, the limit is 190 days. In Paris, for for entire homes, it's 120 days. And then the way you enforce that is through registrations. And so I don't by means want to suggest that we've solved this problem, because I think it's a bit of a kind of whack-a-mole game. But I hope that I do know a couple things. The first thing I'd say is this company started because I couldn't afford to make rent. So I deeply care about housing being affordable, because that's why we started. The vast majority of people, it's hard to know exact number, but in most cities more than 90%, or significantly more than 90%, and in cities where we are actively monitoring, we hope it's 99.9% or 100%, are renting the home they live in. In other words, it's not a dedicated rental. In the vacation rental market, it might be a dedicated rental, because the city actually wants that. And so this is a core principle that we care about, and we ultimately want to enrich cities, make them more efficient. It's all about efficiency, right? Empty space should be filled, but it shouldn't be displaced. And so that's the idea. The only other thing I'll say is about the other challenge we had, the other negative externality we had that we've made huge progress on is discrimination. It's a housing discrimination problem. So we required people to have profiles and photos. The idea of having a profile was you and I get to virtually meet each other. And if you and I couldn't virtually meet each other, there'd be no trust. And you wouldn't open your home, and I'd have no access. So unlocking trust became a huge innovation. But there was this negative externality, which is that you may have unconscious bias. In fact, every one of us has unconscious bias. The whole point of it, you're not conscious. Every person on the planet has unconscious bias of some kind. And then there's worse. There's just racist and people that are highly discriminatory. And so last year, this kind of got to a boil because it became very clear to us there were hosts that were discriminated against guests. And so we ended up hiring the former Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder. He wrote a housing non-discrimination policy. Today, anyone who signs up to use Airbnb, we make them commit that they will not discriminate on the basis of race, religion, who they love, who they pray to. And we make every single person do that. I don't know if there's any other company where when you use the product, they make you sign a commitment. And we made a bunch of other changes, but this is something that we deeply care about. And the last thing I'll say is, our mission is about people accepting one another and about being part of communities. Well, a month ago, Donald Trump, President Trump, I guess, he instituted a travel ban. Some people call that a Muslim ban. And obviously there was, as you're probably following in the United States, there was a huge amount of outrage. And the one thing I'll say is, a company's culture is also when they make a decision that's defining that people might disagree with. And that identifies your values and what you stand for. And we felt like we're a company that brings people together from all countries of the world. And they're cross-border travel. A huge amount of travel is cross-border. Anybody who puts up walls around countries is a risk to our mission, our core ideals. And I think they're going to be on the wrong side of history. Because I think a child today believes they live in a global world, not just a national or local world. And so we decided, I went on Twitter, and I did a simple tweet. I said, anybody who is not allowed in the country because of the travel ban, we will offer free housing to. I wasn't quite expecting the response. It had, I think, almost 200,000 likes on Twitter, more than 100,000 people retweeted it, and I don't have a lot of followers, so it was kind of overwhelming. But 15,000 people signed up to host people for free, refugees or displaced people. And thank you. And we decided to go even bigger. So we made a commitment, we set out a goal that we want to provide housing for 100,000 displaced people over the next 5 years. And I hope 5 years from now we look back on this and say it was conservative and not aggressive. And the last thing I'll say is a few weeks ago, the Super Bowl happened. And it was a Tuesday morning, and the Super Bowl was on a Sunday. And my CMO comes to me, and he says, I have a crazy idea for a Super Bowl ad. And I'm like, oh God, please don't tell me to run a Super Bowl ad. And he shows me this campaign. It's called We Accept. It basically showed a series of faces and it said, we believe no matter who you are, where you're from, who you love, or who you pray to, we all belong. The world is more beautiful when we accept. That was basically the message. And it was a 30-second ad. And you're not really supposed to be able to buy a Super Bowl ad the week before. I don't know why. There was a 30-second slot available in the first quarter. And my heart was pounding. I'm like, I shouldn't do it. So I said, no, we can't run the Super Bowl ad. Wednesday rolls around. I'm like, Jonathan, my CMO asked me again. I'm like, probably, no, let's not do it. Thursday, I go to sleep Wednesday night, and I suddenly regret not running the ad. I'm like, I'm going to always wonder what could have been if I ran this ad. I wake up Thursday morning. The Super Bowl's on Sunday. And remember, Budweiser, these companies buy the ads 2 years in advance. And they start filming 6 months in advance for their ad. And these are tens of millions of dollar campaigns. And I say, is that slot still available? And he said, I'll find out, but if I ask again, they're going to kill me, so I have to accept it. And I said, fine, just buy it. So they buy the spot, and Jonathan comes in and goes, I bought it. And all of a sudden, I said, oh shit. What did I do? I just impulsively bought a Super Bowl spot. What am I going to do? Why did I buy it? And I asked him, I said, can you get a refund? And he said, there's no way. I can't get a refund. you think like why are they going to give your money? Why they're not going to give our money back? They already gave the slot away. And I said, and I was really worried at this point because I'm like, what the hell did I get myself into? I'm going to run this ad that in front of 120 million people. Half the country's going to hate me. The other half might think, who the hell are you telling us about these values, even if we believe in them? And so I thought, well, maybe Jonathan, maybe we can not run the ad. We can pull the ad and just lose the money. He goes, not only will you lose the money, but it will leak. Everyone will see the ad, and it'll be extra embarrassing. So you're stuck with the ad. And I'm like, oh, God. So I was like sick to my stomach. My heart is pounding. The Super Bowl ad comes on Sunday. We decide to run it. Well, we had no choice at that point, and I'm glad we didn't have a choice because we ran the ad, and it was we accept, and it promoted our commitment to providing housing for people that need it. And we had an outpouring of support. It was like the number one most hashtagged and searched ad on Google of any Super Bowl ad, and we spent $40,000 making it, not the multi-million-dollar campaign. And it's one moment I'm proud of, and I'm proud that my team, my co-founders, and others kind of convinced me to do it, because I think who you are is in those defining moments when you do something that the average person would disagree with. And this was, I think, an example of us. So that was my very long answer for you. And as far as an internship, I guess I'll just find you after and I'll give you my email.
I think we've got time for one more question.
So this is like the tone setter, so for the whole night. So make sure it's a good.
Let's go to the seventh row. Yes.
So I am currently the founder of a tech startup that is looking to connect people with interesting things to do while they're on vacation. So it's kind of funny to hear that you guys are going to be doing that. And I was wondering, yeah.
Everything just got incredibly awkward.
I won't say too much about my product.
So don't take any of my advice today. Do the opposite of everything so that we succeed.
I was taking notes, sorry. But anyway, so I'm wondering what a small company can do in order to get partnerships and be able to talk with larger organizations like Airbnb, to be able to create partnerships and to be able to work with companies to provide services.
Wow. Well, I'm going to give you, I don't take this advice personally, because this is not specific about Airbnb and you, but I tried to do what you tried to do in the early days, and it did not go well. In other words, notwithstanding, I'd love to talk to you after and learn about the startup, and maybe something could work out. But notwithstanding all that, my more general advice is if you're a startup, never, ever, 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 or maybe not ever, ever, but be very, very careful about ever partnering with a large company. It almost never works. And the reason why it never works is because if you're a small company, that partnership and all the resources it may depend to make that partnership with a big company work may be your entire company's resources. So you have a small team, presumably, and if you were to partner with a large company, all of your resources would be used in that company. Whereas us, the large company, it's like a small thing, and then we have like a list of 100 things. So it's an uneven relationship. It's the top of your list, it's lower on another company's list, and we have a longer horizon, and we might move slower than you can move. And so you also have cultural differences of stages, that you have a different threshold of risk than us. So my general thought is it's almost like, I don't have a good analogy, but it's just like, it's often not meant to be and unnatural. And we try to do the same thing. We kept thinking there's a silver bullet. And the silver bullet is a distribution with this organization. But our organization had totally backwards priorities than we had as an early company. So my high level advice, and the good news is I'm happy to talk to you, but my high level advice beyond that is when you grow without major partnerships and distribution, it requires you to do something 10x better than what exists. So like, for example, if you want to do something that could partner with us or even compete with us, what I would tell you is you can't be as good as us and you can't be twice as better as us. You have to be 10 times better. You have to do something that's almost unnatural for everyone else to do. And the truth is that we, a company, are robust. We're really big. We have a lot of people, a lot of resources. But we're, as much as I want us to be the biggest startup, we're never as nimble as you. And that, like, we used to have a website. Now we have a phone application. Like, we're not as native to mobile as somebody who never had a website. And there's emerging technology, new platforms, so you can embrace new things easier than us switching people over. So there's many ways for a startup to get to scale. And I think it's about building something somebody wants. It's about being 10x better, not 2x better. And it's about finding a space that no one exists in. And often, once you get to some scale, then those companies will partner with you. But the early stage startup to mature companies are usually unnatural matches, and it's pretty rare. Maybe early days of Instagram, they got a fair amount of distribution through Twitter. We leverage Craigslist and things, but it wasn't a partnership. We found a hack, and we were able to create a hack where a host could post their listing and it would get reposted to Craigslist. And a lot of companies find hacks to be able to leverage larger companies. PayPal leveraged eBay, but not with eBay's cooperation. So, my high level thought is to build something that people can't ignore that's 10x better. And the way you make something 10x better is obsess over a small number of people and do something that they are totally obsessed with. And they're totally obsessed with it when you don't ask them if they liked it. They literally proactively write you long letters telling you they loved you, and they tell everyone they know about it. And the bigger you get, the harder that becomes. Because it's easy to make 10 people really love something you make, but once you have 1 million people, it's a diffusion of energy. It's really, really hard. So that's my high level, is when you're a startup, focus inward, and these partnerships often just destroy you.
Perfect, thank you.
Sorry about that advice, because I know you kind of wanted let's do something together.
Yeah, no. That's really good advice, thank you.
Thank you.
And the last question will come from me.
Oh.
10 years ago, you had no money to afford a flat. Now you have a company that you're in charge of that is valued at 30 billion and is now profit making. In 10 years' time, what do you want your goal to be, and how are you going to evaluate it?
Whoa.
Perhaps your personal goal rather than...
Yeah. I would say 10 years from now, I would like the following. I'm stalling to think of my answer. Here's what it is. I want to build a community. I want Airbnb to be a community 10 years from now that has 1 billion people in it. And we have 150 million people today. And in that billion-person community, I would like for 1 billion people to be able to go to literally any town, any neighborhood, and we have designed perfect end-to-end trips for them. So we not just provide where you stay, but we provide everything about what you can do. By then, I hope we've taken steps to help make a leap forward in how you travel, physically move, meaning aviation, and how we move around. I think 10 years from now, there's going to be fewer people that will live on one-year leases. This notion of being mobile? Well, it turns out until 10,000 years ago, all humans were mobile. They're nomadic. We evolved to be people who traveled. And for hundreds of thousands of years, humans were travelers. And I think that 10 years from now, humans can become travelers again. But it's only possible if they can go to communities as fluidly as they can go home. And there's an old Robert Frost quote that said, home is anywhere where you go, they have to take you in. And so the notion is, what if every neighborhood you could call home? And what if 1 billion people could say that? And it sounds crazy. It's actually less crazy than if you interviewed me 10 years ago. I'm unemployed and I say I have this idea with air mattresses, and that's going to be a $30 billion company. So I think there's real opportunities, and we've helped make a big change in how people stay, and I'd like to do that a few more times. And I hope how we got there is having an incredibly innovative culture that was really high trust, and people felt like I want people to be able to say, who work at Airbnb, many years from now, 50 years from now, when I was alive at that period of time, that's where it was happening. That's where the most creative people were. And I don't know if we'll get there, but that is my North Star. Great.